All right, guys, welcome to the Democracy and Reform in Great Britain review video. Hopefully, this will help you prepare for tomorrow's quiz and get a better understanding of all the things we've been talking about in class. So, the big picture, we've been talking about the 1800s and the struggle for democratic rights from various groups. We had everyone from France to England, and these groups were often viewed and treated as if they were a threat. And, in many cases, they may have been. They certainly were a threat to the established order. In France, we saw these groups, particularly with a third estate, the Jacobins, the radical with Robespierre in the beginning. We saw the sans-culottes in the streets of Paris fighting for working class rights, maybe even some of them calling for socialism. And in England, we see the Chartists primarily, the suffragettes, and even a group we're going to look at called the Fabians, which we have not talked about in class yet. Now, these groups all fought in various ways and in some shape or form for rights. Now, in England, in contrast to France, there was no massive revolution in the 1800s, and part of this has to do with England's history of rights for people besides the king. Going back as far as 1215, you have the Magna Charta, which gave nobles the power to check the king, the power of King John at the time, but this is a very elite group. Flash forward to 1689, there is the Glorious Revolution in which King James is booted out of power, and the British Parliament invites William and Mary to be King and Queen of England. And they do so on condition that they live up to a Bill of Rights. They create an English Bill of Rights, largely influenced by John Locke, who wrote his treatise on government in 1689. This is where the idea of the consent of the governed comes into popularity, put into practice when Parliament gets to check the power of the king, and the lawmakers in Parliament are elected by the governed people, by the people of England. This is what is called a constitutional monarchy. And if you think back to France, they were an absolute monarchy where the king, King Louis, in the case of the revolution, had total control. Different. Now, despite being semi-democratic here, the voting requirements were very limited as to who could vote. You had to be male and you had to own a lot of property, huge estates. And when it came down to it, only 1 in every 100 person could vote. So this is by no means a democracy, but there is a little more vote than you had in France. Although you could argue that 1 in 100 are kind of like the first and second estate in France. Sorry. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that the Industrial Revolution is going on. We have cities growing in population, but they don't have any representation in Parliament. We have the middle class growing, and these guys can't vote because despite their wealth in businesses, they don't have enough property and wealth to vote. So they are also left out, even though they are now becoming the drivers of this new industrial revolution. England is still operating, the government is still operating on the premise that you must be a noble, a titled nobility to have much of a vote. The middle class is operating outside that noble hereditary system. Of course, you have the industrialists, which are actually kind of part of the middle class, maybe upper middle class in many cases. They also don't own the property requirements to vote. And you also have the working class, masses of workers who are flooding into the cities, and they certainly don't have any property, so they can't vote either. So the government by the 1800s is appearing for many reasons to be outdated. The representations are all in the countryside, and the majority of the people in this new economy are left out. We begin to have demonstrations throughout the early 1800s, the most famous of which were the Peterloo demonstrations. They're known by many people as the Peterloo massacres, as the protesters who were protesting for universal suffrage and more rights and religious liberty. They were being attacked by the troops, as you can see here. The painter who made this painting made a note to put the liberty caps on top of the post. As you can see, the flags have liberty caps, which is a direct reference to the French Revolution. This brings up the point that many conservatives in England at the time were worried that any amount of rights to the people would be a slippery slope to the French Revolution, to terror, to republicanism, which is what the French Revolution came to demonstrate. And the French Revolution did two things, and they're often at odds. It inspired many people to ask for more rights, but it also inspired many government officials to crack down really hard on any revolution because the idea of a republic or people having a say was associated with the taint of terror and the guillotine in France. In England, you begin to have disenfranchised people without the right to vote pushing for the right to vote, and many people were fearful that each demonstration and each government crackdown, we were looking at the breakdown of society, and revolution might be near. What do we do? Parliament decides they need to act. And they passed, after much debate, the Reform Act of 1832, which lowers the property qualifications to vote. It now creates an electorate where 1 in every 32 people can vote. Remember from the other slide, it was 1 in every 100. So this is certainly an expansion of the franchise of the voting population. But as you saw from the other video earlier, if you didn't see it, go back and watch it. There's two sides to this debate. Some see this as a march towards progress and democracy. Others see it as a conspiracy against the working class to isolate the working class, because the middle class got the right to vote, but the working class now feel betrayed. Chartists, and we looked at a lot of their documents. We tried to decide whether or not they were a threat. But what we do know is that their methods typically were about petitioning Parliament, holding meetings and rallies, and it was these rallies that occasionally got violent, especially after their petition, the charter, was rejected by Parliament, and they were infiltrated by police spies. And as a result, Parliament was able to ignore their needs initially. But as you watch the 1800s move on, most of the reforms that they asked for were passed, most notably the Reform Act of 1867, which gave nearly all males in England the right to vote. Talk about, but I do want to mention briefly because I think it pertains to our game we're playing, is the Fabian Society. Now, these guys were middle class, respectable middle class, educated people who happened to be socialists. They believed in the idea that the government and the economy as well should be run by the people, and that the wealth of this massive industrial British nation should be used more equitably to help everybody out. They call for things like a minimum wage for workers. They call for an old age pension, that after you hit a certain age, you put your time in, that you should get an income, guaranteed income in your old age till you could survive. They saw fit to fight for unemployment benefits. If you are laid off because of no fault of your own, there should be an income for you so you can survive. Basically, these guys saw the kind of worst elements of the Industrial Revolution and said, yes, this wealth is amazing, this power is amazing, but it is too heartless and brutal, and we need to look after one another, and we have the wealth and means to do it, so we should do it. They also called for universal health care. They said health insurance should be something that everyone has as a human right, and they formed the Labour Party. These were middle-class people who, after 1832, could vote. So they formed a political party called the Labour Party, which is still in existence in England now. They petitioned, they had meetings, they wrote books, and they elected over time many Fabian or Labour candidates to Parliament. And they would lobby Parliament, and the results are that they don't have a socialist revolution in England, which is not what they were really looking for, but they did create a lot of socialist-like policies that by the 20th century are completely adopted by Britain in a much more greater degree than in many other countries, certainly more than the United States as far as social democracy goes. All right, and then last group we talked about, they began to demand a number of issues, but the issue that became the most loudest and most obvious was the suffrage or the right to vote campaign. So if you look at this, though, they were in kind of an uphill battle. They began to wage a propaganda war, and you'd see, give the mother the vote. We need it. Vote for our mothers. If you look at this poster, what they do is they're arguing for a radical idea at the time. The women should have the right to vote, but they're using the maternal kind of cult of domesticity idea to win that over. See, they're playing on the fact that they're mothers and they're caretakers, and that they, as mothers and caretakers, have a lot of say over food, homes, health, schools, really important things, but yet they can't actually vote. And here we have a lot of response. This is from a British magazine called Puck. This is in response to the notion that they are the queen of the home. This is where their domain is. And it's hard to read here, but it says queen of the home, says the anti-suffragists. Yes, queen of the cook stove throne. So it's implying that women are beginning to want more than just being in the house. And the reaction was pretty fierce on the other side. And it wasn't just men, it was women and men who just said, no, this is the world turned upside down. And they would often portray suffragists and feminists as they would distort their vision. So here we have a sign that says down with men and up with the women, which is really not what they were fighting for. They were fighting for equality. And I think a lot of this kind of misperception happens as well today. Here we have another anti-suffrage cartoon. You have votes for women. This is a suffragette's house, and you can see that she's dressed like a man. She has a derby hat on. The father, God forbid, has to hold the babies. This is what will become if we let women have the right to vote. The men will be, forced to take care of the house, and the house will be. If you look at the house, it's a mess, right? Because the woman's not doing the job. And then we have another one again, portraying the suffragists as kind of radical, crazy people. And if you remember from class, they were certainly radical. Some of them, the WSBU, they used many cases, terrorist campaign of bombing property. There's also just the social fear that this is what it's like right now, and this cartoon was captioned, "What will become of women?" And the after fact is right here. They'll turn into these cigar smoking, inappropriate women who are, not quite as attractive and laying back and cut their hair. And it was really not so much about giving the right to vote per se as this social fear of a world turned upside down. This is also another portrayal of suffragists as being loudmouth because they're calling and it said it used to be like this. And if you look at the corner, she says, "Yes, dear. No, dear. I agree with you, dear." And then, if we give them the right to vote, they'll be abusing men, as are shown here. Now, just nuts and bolts. Suffragettes, how do they fight for things? Their goals were to get voting rights and property rights for married women. Those were the kind of two specific things they began to fight for. They did this by forming groups, the most famous and radical of which in England was called the Women's Social and Political Union. And they also had lectures. What our newspaper articles we saw yesterday said were inflammatory speeches. And in many cases, I think it could be described as terrorism. They built bombs and tried to burn down and attack property that was aimed to grab attention. And again, we can debate how effective this was, but they eventually do get the right to vote in 19. So, in a nutshell, we begin to have disenfranchised people protest and rally, some going quite radical. This inspires and pressures those who have the power. By 1832, it was the middle class to vote and push for reforms. And we end up getting democratic reform and change in England without revolution. One could argue that it's evolution, not revolution, in England. So we will talk more about this. There are some other things going on that we haven't gotten to yet, like imperialism and World War I, which is coming around the corner as far as our class is concerned. So this may have also had a role in passing some reforms, but we'll get there when we get to that.